Okay, today we're going to be going over adolescence, and this is going to be chapter 11. And this is going to be the physical and cognitive stages, and normally we kind of gloss over the physical stages, but in adolescence it's a lot more important for some pretty obvious reasons. Mostly we get to talk about sex all day, which everybody loves. Now, adolescence is we kind of consider the last stage of development, which is a complete crock, but we kind of think of it like that anyway, where when we think of developmental psychology, we understand that childhood you develop as a baby. We even throw like uteral development in there, still in the womb, and then we're like, well, adolescents, then they are the person that they're going to be. Um, and but as you can tell, we're barely halfway through the semester, so clearly this is not the end of things. And one of the things you'll notice, and if you're still a teenager, then you have to ask like an adult person this. Um, but for those of you who are say over the age of 25, you've been out of teenagerhood for quite a while, out of adolescence, and you look back to yourself 5 years ago, sometimes only a couple of years ago, and you were a moron. That's generally how you look back at yourself. You're like, oh my god, I can't believe I made all these mistakes. What was I thinking? Why couldn't I see what was plainly obvious in front of me? And essentially, it's because you were stupid. Usually, that's what I think when I look at myself a couple of years back. Um, and but the trick is, every 5 years, you're going to look at yourself 5 years ago and think you were a moron. And so take a wild guess what you are right now. Um, it, Looking back at yourself 5 years from now, you're going to think that you made a lot of stupid mistakes. And more importantly, you're going to have this constant feeling of change. Now, in the West, we like to think that we have like a core being, and we mentioned last time that during during the middle childhood years, a person really starts to get their sense of self concept. But self concept is something that's different based on the culture. So in our culture, we think of the self concept as who and what we are. But in other cultures, pretty much the most of the world, um, the sense of self is very fluid. That's actually why most people in the world believe in reincarnation. Um, because they believe in it. They don't believe that you die and then you get reborn as you, but in a different body. You're a totally different person, and that's fine. Just like you're a totally different person now than you were 5 years ago. And we hate that idea. We like to say, but there was a core me that didn't change. And they don't necessarily believe that. I mean, think about how much you've changed in the last 5 years, and then realize you're probably going to live another 50 years. How much different are you going to be in 50 years? There will be almost no part of you that is similar, and that's fine. So we don't want to think of adolescence as the last stage of development. It's just another bump in the road. Now, when we look at adolescence as kind of a turbulent time, it's kind of interesting to us. We generally take one of two mentalities on why adolescence is so difficult. Because let's face it, there is a very little more lame than a teenager. And we'll get into the inherent really incredible lameness and arrogance of teenagers once we get into the social and emotional development of teenagers, with the lack thereof. It's quite laughable, um, as I'm sure all of us were when we were teenagers as well. Um, but we usually like to think of it in one of two ways. First of all, we'll say, well, of course they're difficult. He's just a rage of hormones. Um, Now, or we'll say, well, adolescence is a very difficult time for people. So we either take the very biological approach of they're a rage of hormones, or the very social approach of it's a difficult time. Both of them are complete bunk, by the way. They are not a rage of hormones. After about the age of 13, the hormones have generally stabilized. They're used to it. You can't just explain every single one of their actions, or hardly any of them, as they just have way too many hormones. Um, and really, when they're going through that very hormonal time, they're pretty manageable. They're not at that pain in the butt stage yet. Um, and so we say it's a difficult time, but you know what? It isn't a difficult time. I mean, anybody who is not a teenager now can look back to their teenage years and think that was a vacation. That was a 7 year long vacation where I had no real responsibilities. Nothing really could go wrong. Uh, you know, even people that had really bad childhoods usually have worse adulthoods. Um, I mean, let's face it, for the typical teenager, the worst thing that could go wrong is he'll fail a test and get yelled at by his mom. Um, as an adult, the worst thing that could happen is you screw up at work and then you get fired and then you and your family starve to death because you can't afford to feed them. It's a different scale, really, of responsibility. So it's not a difficult time. Everything is provided for these individuals who are, physiologically speaking, capable of providing for themselves. Um, so why is it different? Well, we do have a lot of different social things that we do. Like I said, these are people who are physically developed by the time they're about 14 years old, and yet we shelter them. And this isn't something we've done all the time. This is a very recent adaptation that we've had in our culture. And it's not even every culture. We still have a lot of other cultures where they don't do this. Um, but we will tell our teenagers that they can't do anything, that they're not ready for anything, they're not ready for this, they're not ready for that, you don't know this, you don't know this. Um, and then we don't give them any responsibility. We don't teach them anything until they're like 17. Then we get around to finally admitting that they're going to leave the house soon and they need to know how to wash their own clothes or whatever these sad little things we've been doing for them the whole time. So we have very, very low expectations of our teenagers and generally of our children in general. And we teach them almost nothing. We do not teach them how to be ready. We don't teach them how to handle the emotions. We don't teach them how to handle almost anything. And honestly, that's a big part of it, the social aspect. Now, getting into the physical development, because this chapter is all about the physical and the cognitive development, and they're very intertwined, obviously, in the puberty ages. And they go over puberty. There's a table, table 11.1 on page 287, and it's a good table, but it's named wrong. It's called like pubertal changes or something like that. Ignore the word pubertal. It's not real for this purpose. The fact is, physically speaking, there are two types of characteristics that you'll have sexually. The first one is called a primary sexual characteristic, and they go over this in the book for like a sentence. And the primary sexual characteristic is the sexual characteristic that defines who you are as a sex. You are male or you are female or you are intersex or hermaphrodite. And and this has nothing to do with who you identify with or gay or straight or anything like that. But so if you own a penis, then you are a male. That is your sex. And that is your primary sexual characteristics. You have your penis, your testicles, the uterus, the ovaries, the vagina, this sort of thing. But what we think of as sexual is often the secondary sexual characteristics, and these are all the sexual characteristics that come into play during puberty. Now, my 7-year-old daughter is just as much of a female as a 40-year-old woman. But we don't like to think of her as female because we say, well, she's not sexual. No, she's just as sexual. She has a sex. She doesn't have any secondary sexual characteristics. And the table 11.1 goes over this. And there's actually a wide variety of secondary sexual characteristics. Now, some of them we know. A woman's breasts grow. Everybody knows that one. The hips get wider. Waist doesn't get wider. The legs get a little longer. We know these. Some of the ones that we don't know are that the lips get thicker. They get up to 50% thicker. And even more interestingly, a lot of these secondary sexual characteristics are very tied to the sexual act as well. So we've evolved them as symbols of our sexual arousal, as being ready and available for sex. So a woman's lips, for example, get 25 to 33% larger as they become engorged with blood when she's sexually aroused. And a lot of people don't know that. That's actually why this culture developed females putting on lipstick, specifically red lipstick, because it's a sign that the blood is engorged to that area. It makes them look fuller, and it makes them look sexually available. They don't know that's what they're doing, but that's what they're doing. If somebody puts on lipstick that's like a brown color, then they're trying to hide the sexual availability. You're saying, there is no blood going into these lips, so this might be what you'd want for like a more professional look. you're trying to look sexually unavailable. Perhaps if you like I said, trying to be taken seriously in a professional setting or something like that. So we know these things so instinctively that we incorporate them into how we look good, which is fascinating, really, even if we don't know that they're there. Something a lot of people don't know is that the female's breasts get 25% larger when she's sexually aroused. I actually once saw a thermal image and it was sped up so you could see the changes of a woman lying on a bed, and she was becoming sexually aroused. I don't know if they were reading their dirty book or whatever, um, but it was interesting to watch the thermal pattern change as the blood flow completely changed in her body. The stomach, the forehead, they got very cold, and meanwhile the breasts got very hot, the lips got hot, the vulva got very hot, because these are all signs of sexual arousal. Um, the legs get a little bit longer. Now, for men, you have a totally different pattern of secondary sexual characteristics. By the way, contrary to common belief, the female's voice does change after puberty, but it gets lower, not higher. It just doesn't get as low as a man's. Now, a man's secondary sexual characteristics, our voice deepens, penis gets larger, testicles get larger, our chest broadens, our whole base, we get that V torso, and our muscle density increases quite a bit. Now, it's interesting to note that the different races have different levels of. We increase in height, by the way, as a secondary sexual characteristic as well. It's interesting to note that the different races have different levels of expressing these secondary sexual characteristics. So, Asians, for example, if you actually look at the physical differences between the races, and I'm not counting the fact that Asians have a slightly different shaped eye, whatever. Um, but the physical differences between the races, Asians, for example, are shorter. The women get less thick lips, less large breasts. Their legs don't lengthen out as much. These are all secondary sexual characteristics. Essentially, the secondary sexual they don't look as sexually available. We still think they look very pretty, but but they don't have those extraordinary secondary sexual characteristics. Where anybody of African descent, they tend to have more exaggerated secondary sexual characteristics. The males have wider shoulders. They get muscle density a lot easier. That's actually one of the reasons why black guys tend to work out more than white guys, because we don't get the same reward that the black guys do. I can work out 2 hours a day. He can work out 2 hours a day, and he will just flat out look better than I do because he's going to have naturally more muscle density than I do. His muscles are more prone to that. They're going to have a tendency to be taller than whites, and the females are going to have the enlarged hips, the enlarged breasts, enlarged lips, all secondary sexual characteristics. Essentially, the main difference between blacks and whites is blacks are just flat out sexier than whites on a physiological level. Um, Now, speaking of the evolution of this, um, one of the things that's kind of predominant in the adolescent years is the fact that, like I said, adolescents are a pain in the butt. They argue with everybody. Part of this, evolutionarily speaking, is very advantageous because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get themselves kicked out of the nest. This is a time, I probably mentioned that when chimpanzee is rearing the child, it goes from holding the child almost 98% of the time to beating the child 98% of the time every time the child comes up to it. So there's a lot of arguing when the child needs to leave to continue their social development. Once the physical development is done, it's time for the social development. So arguing and being a pain in the butt can be evolutionarily advantageous if they're trying to leave the nest. Now, of course, in this culture, we don't want them to leave the nest. We don't prepare them to leave the nest, but they still have that tendency to argue with us and be a pain in the butt to try to assert their own independence because physically they need to. Now, this is also a time developmentally when physical attractiveness comes in. And there's a whole lot of things that play into physical attractiveness. For those of you who don't have children yet, I want you to take a second and imagine when you do have children that they're ugly as sin. These are just some hideous little beasts. Because that's kind of what you need to be prepared for. We all know that not every child is as attractive as their mother wants it to be. And certainly not as attractive as their mother pretends that it is. I swear, I was walking by a little kid in the shopping shopping at a grocery store one day, and I just did a double take. I'm just like, it's a, it's a hideous little beast. I felt bad for the parents. Um, and you know that's the reality. It seems almost blasphemy to say, oh, well, he can be ugly, but yay, some people are ugly. And fortunately, though, just because you're ugly in one stage doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be ugly in another stage. Um, let's face it, the things that make babies cute are round cherubic faces. Once they get to be a toddler, cherubic just looks kind of chunky. Once they get to be in middle childhood, cherubic is downright bad. Heck, I knew a kid in college that I had seen pictures of him all the way through, and I'm still good friends with him now. He was downright homely his entire life until he hit about 25. And then the extra, masculinity caught up with him, and he's actually a very attractive man now. But those features just did not work for a kid. He looked tall and lanky and bony, and it just didn't work for him. So don't be afraid to have ugly kids. Doesn't mean that they're gonna have a hard life. But the fact of the matter is, um, attractiveness is going to kick in really strongly once you're in adolescence for a whole lot of reasons. First of all, you are developing these secondary sexual characteristics, and some people are flat out going to be more attractive than others. We had mentioned that your self-concept really gets solidified a few years before this. Well, at this point, you now start to get body image problems. And we're going to talk about body image for quite a bit, but not in the way that you've probably ever heard it talked about before. Um, because again, this isn't clinical. This isn't trying to make people feel happy about themselves. I don't care if any of you feel happy about yourself. I just want to educate you on how people actually work, whether we like how they work or not. Um, and body image in this particular country is actually, people talk about unrealistic body image with the media and whatnot. It's actually less realistic for men than it is for women, and that seems almost blasphemous to say. And I say that because in this country, with our current level of ideals, which may change in 10 years, but for right now, it is very easy for a woman to do aerobics for about 20 minutes a day, watch what she eats, and have a relatively ideal figure. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we want to watch what we eat or do aerobics for 20 minutes a day, but if you did, you would get a relatively ideal figure, the type of figure you might see in a movie. Perhaps not a supermodel, but pretty good. For a man, on the other hand, in order to look like anything you would see in a movie, we don't just get to watch what we eat. We have to completely change our diet and lifestyle. We have to put down massive, literally thousands of calories of protein, and then we need to work out between 3 and 4 hours a day. Then we can achieve what you would see as average in a movie. Um, so really, as far as body expectations go, you would think women would have it easy, because men have such a more unrealistic expectation uh, than women do. The thing is, we handle the problems differently. Men have a lot of pride, so we don't see the people that work out all the time and say, I have to be like that in order to be attractive. We just see the people that see that as attractive, and we say to them, you are unrealistic, because that is how we handle our personal pride issues. And women handle it differently and often take it upon themselves. Now, we talked about obesity in some of the discussions with the news anchor and the bullying and whatnot, and um, and so you get a lot of people that deal with body image problems, and it doesn't really hit until you're in about puberty. For those that does hit before puberty, they're probably being fed the body image problem the whole time. They're being told this Barbie will make you feel fat, that sort of thing. And by the way, Barbie is not particularly anatomically incorrect. I know there's a lot of people talking about how horrible Barbies are, but the reality is if you were to scale her up, yeah, her waist would be about this thin, and her clothes would be about that thick. So if you're going to put clothes that thick on somebody, the inner skeleton kind of has to be unrealistic in order to make the end result look even moderately correct. I mean, it's a toy. Anime isn't particularly realistic either. It's not designed to be. Um, So there are definitely those few that are going to get body image problems before they hit puberty. But at this point, they're really going to start to get body image problems. And a lot of it is what's referred to as fat shaming. And this is being ashamed for being fat. Now, this is another thing that is obviously evolutionarily advantageous, because even though we're talking about physical attractiveness here, you can't talk about obesity without having it be a weight issue. We do happen to think it's a physical attractiveness issue as well in this country, but it is definitely a health issue. Um, and so the idea of being ashamed of being fat is evolutionarily advantageous. If you are motivated to do something, it's because you hate the alternative. Um, I tell you, I didn't go back to college until I had already worked for 5 years doing a bunch of crappy jobs. I was incredibly motivated to do well in college, so I didn't have to go back to flipping pizzas. I worked at like 6 different Italian places. It was a nightmare. Um, I didn't want to do that again, so I was very motivated. I was ashamed of my current role, so I bettered myself. Um, a little bit of shame is not bad. You are not obligated to try to make every obese person feel good about themselves. If you are in a bad situation, you probably shouldn't feel good about themselves. It's okay to acknowledge that you're unhealthy. The physical attractiveness, by all means, downplay that. That is very culturally specific and completely secondary to the health issues. Um, and that doesn't mean that anything can't be taken to extremes. Obviously, somebody can feel so ashamed that they give up. We've talked about cognitive dissonance. We'll talk about cognitive dissonance a little while later. Um, and we use cognitive dissonance when it comes to obesity and different body image things. And we tackle it a little differently. You get let's say you take a female, again, because males tackle the problem cognitively a little differently. A female who's overweight. As we mentioned with cognitive dissonance, you're going to have, she knows overweight is bad, yet she's overweight, so she's going to have cognitive dissonance, and she can solve it in one of three ways. One, she can change her weight. She can put down the fork and stop eating. And trust me, contrary to what people love to talk about, it is about eating. It's also about physical activity. But even anorexics, they have to maintain their weight. If they just started eating a normal diet, they'd go back up to a normal weight. Perhaps not as easily as somebody else. You might have a predisposition to be more or less overweight, but you still need to maintain weight. Um, but of course, people don't like to do that. That's work. So instead of just losing weight, they will perhaps try to do the other thing, change the beliefs. Well, you know what? Being fat isn't that bad. That's what they'll say. They'll say, I'm proud of who I am. I accept who I am. And this is just kind of generally a lie that people tell themselves, just like with all cognitive dissonance, to try to make themselves feel better. And indeed, they might accept who they are. But then again, in this case, like I said, it's a health issue. It's not necessarily a physical attractiveness. By all means, accept how physically attractive you are. There's not a lot you can do about that outside of some major cosmetic surgery for the most part. Although there are exceptions to that I'll talk about in a second. Um, and the third thing they'll do, which they do quite a bit, is do bridging beliefs. Now, when we talked about the news anchor, there was somebody in every discussion that mentioned, you know what, she's not that fat. I've seen worse. That's a bridging belief. Of course you've seen worse. There are insanely overweight people out there. But that doesn't mean that this woman was healthy by any stretch of the imagination. She had a very severe health problem, statistically lopping 20 or 30 years off her life. And by all means, we've seen worse. I saw a YouTube video of like the fattest guy ever, and he was almost 1,000 pounds. He actually had almost a 200-pound tumor removed from his leg. He didn't even know it was there because it was just part of the mass. Sure, there are worse things out there, but that's just a bridging belief. That's a worse way of lying to yourself. Some people, very common with weight is they'll say, well, I'm fat, but, or whatever word they use to make them. I'm using the word fat because it's the most derogatory one, and we're talking about body image problems, so this is what the person's saying to themselves. They're like, well, yes, I'm fat, but I don't really eat a lot, so it's not my fault. And again, it's completely untrue. You'd be surprised what happens when people start counting calories and realizing exactly how much they're putting down on a regular basis. Or, well, I have a thyroid problem, and by all means, that makes it easier to gain weight, but it's not. It doesn't magically go on by itself. It needs fuel. Um, so we have this cognitive dissonance that kicks in, and we need to learn to aim that cognitive dissonance correctly, so that we can have the body image problems. We can say, I'm not ideal, but instead of, and then we can make the choice to make ourselves ideal. Um, Now, on the subject of physical attractiveness, life is easier if you're pretty. And that's just a fact. And we love to deny that fact, by the way. We like to say that, well, you know what? You shouldn't like somebody because they're attractive. That should not be why you should pursue them. And that's just flat out untrue for a whole lot of reasons. Sex is one of the things that keeps a relationship together. You want to be attracted to your partner. You want to be attractive to your partner. Um, and it's not really as shallow as we like to say it is. Uh, but life is flat out easier if you're physically attractive. There is something called the attractiveness bias. It is a psychological effect. It's a very predominant one. We will naturally assume good things about attractive people. So if there's an attractive person, we will actually, oddly enough, the attractiveness bias works backwards in one way. We tend to assume they're less intelligent than average people, but we'll still put them in a leadership position. You can actually go back through the history books and look at the two people that ran for president and pretty much figure out who was going to win based on how attractive they were, which is crazy. But I mean, even now, Obama, good-looking man. Um, Heck, the only reason George W. Bush won was because Kerry was homely. Um, so we have this attractiveness bias. We like attractive people more. We give them more things. There's also a psychological effect called the halo effect. This is where when someone has one advantage, you assume they have other advantages as well. And attractiveness is a very salient advantage. I think I mentioned this once before in discussion, so I'll just say salient means very observable, very easy to see. Attractiveness is very easy to see advantage. So this is something even we professors do. I swear, if I had a nickel for every time I thought this stupid thing, and I kick myself for it every time, I'll see like an attractive female sitting up front, and then I see her test, and she stinks, and I'm like, oh, well, I thought she was smarter then. I'm like, that's a stupid thing to say. Why would she be smarter just because she was physically attractive? Um, but again, with the halo effect, we will often assume that when somebody has one advantage, they have other advantages as well. And this works into attractiveness because we see that advantage. Um, as far as this goes, we'll go. We have problems with the puberty. Talking about the physical development here of adolescence. You're going through puberty. The people are getting physically attractive. This winds up causing a lot of tension in the home life because if let's say it's a daughter going through puberty, becoming physically attractive, the father will find her sexually attractive, and this will cause a lot of tension. And there's nothing wrong with this, by the way. First of all, your dad finds a whole host of people sexually attractive. He walks down the street, sees an attractive woman, and says to himself, she is sexually attractive. I am sexually attracted to her. It would be very unnatural if you, being an attractive person, did not have somebody who found your gender attractive to find you attractive. That would just be weird. But since people don't think like that, they have a hard time handling it. And it's the same thing with the daughters, by the way. The daughters will find the fathers attractive. The sons will find the mothers attractive, if they're indeed attractive. And that can often lead to some tension until they basically work it out that they're no different than any other person walking down the street. They're not going to go jump on them. And everything is really okay. Before I get into the last aspects of sex, I do want to talk about anorexia because this is another aspect that I didn't care for with the book. When they defined anorexia, they started the definition by saying it is a tragic eating disorder. Wow, I really hate the clinical bias in this book. Every disorder is tragic. It's not like anybody has any disorder. They're like, yeah, I'm bipolar, and it's great. No, it's tragic. That's the whole point. That's why it's a disorder. It is just an eating disorder. It is, I like a little bit less bias in my science. And anorexia is a very culturally specific disorder. It's very Western. There are other culturally specific mental disorders, by the way, that are fascinating. There's one, I believe it's called Koro from China, where the men, typically rural men, um, they believe in kind of like a yin and yang life energy, and the yang is the masculine life energy, and they feel that their testicles are receding into their body. And if they completely recede, they won't be able to produce yang anymore. They'll be all yin, and then they will die. And so they try to construct these elaborate things to pull their testicles down so they don't recede into their body. And to us, this sounds crazy, right? Trying to yank your testicles, um, like weighing them down with bricks and stones and whatnot. And that sounds crazy, but I'll tell you, to these poor people in China, the fact that some rich chick doesn't want to eat, that sounds just as crazy. Um, so this is a very culturally specific disorder. Um, there's a fantastic picture on page 292. I think it should be the poster for all anorexics, because I'll tell you, it's a kind of before and after picture of a girl who's anorexic, and then she 10 weeks later she puts on normal weight and she's 10 times more attractive than she was before. And this isn't one of those I'll shock you by showing you my ribs pictures. No, it's just a girl in a t-shirt, and even her face looks horrible when she's anorexic, and it looks good when she's not. Um, but back to sex, because everybody loves that. I'll check my time here. Um, these are children who are going through puberty, and they're trying to learn all these things about puberty. They try to learn sexual orientation. Um, it mentions in the book that 2 to 3% of teenagers consider themselves gay, and yet we all know that 10% of the population is gay. Um, Keep in mind, very often overlooked statistic. That's actually based on the 1959 Kinsey study, where they did find out that 10% of the population was gay. They also found out that 10% of the population was straight. The rest are somewhere in the middle, that it's a big continuum with about 10% on each 10% breakup. So what this means is that we are naturally predisposed, just like every other mammal. It's not just humans, by the way. Like every other mammal, you will see one male dog hump another male dog, and the male dog in the bottom doesn't look around and go gay or anything dumb like that. He's a dog. That's what they do. And humans are the same thing. We are naturally predisposed to find other humans sexually attractive. Some will naturally find one gender slightly more attractive than the other. Um, and this is kind of difficult for kids to understand, because we don't tend to talk to kids about sex. And this, in my opinion, is almost criminal. Um, because as adults, we have kids now, we understand the whole thing, and we know that our child at one point in their life is going to have sex. As a matter of fact, just like us, we know that sex is going to be an incredibly important part of that child's life. It's going to hold their marriage together. It's going to hold their relationship together. It's going to be the impetus to everybody they date long before they ever get married. It's going to be how they define their physical attractiveness and how comfortable they feel with their body. It's going to be so incredibly important to them. And yet, if I were to ask you guys how many of your parents talk to you about sex, I'd get 10%. I ask this every semester, 10 to 20%. That is horrible. Um, your parents knew how important this was going to be to you. They know you're learning about this as a teenager. It's starting to be important to you, and they didn't even talk to you about it. That's horrible. So you need to talk to kids about sex. It is your job to talk to kids about sex, just as important as it is to feed them or to teach them not to murder people. This is something that they're going to do. They might never even get the urge to murder people, but they're going to get the urge to have sex with someone. Now, they mention in the book, they have this little chart on how to talk to people about sex, and it's a vague little clinical thing that is generally useless. Um, so I'll go over some very specific things. I may have mentioned some of this in the toddler section or the middle childhood section. Um, when you talk to kids about sex, you have to do it right from the very beginning. They say, where do babies come from? Don't lie. One of the worst things you can do is lie to children. I actually discourage people to tell their children about religion. Don't tell your child about Santa Claus. Don't tell your child about the Tooth Fairy or Frosty the Snowman or any of these little lies. I know we think it's cute, but it's very difficult for the child to understand when you're lying to them and when you're not. So if you say one day the babies came from the Cabbage Patch and then later on you say, okay, I was lying before, but now I'm going to tell you the truth, how much credibility do you really have at this point? It's kind of rough. So kid asks where babies come from. You say the man has a seed, the girl has an egg. The guy gives a seed to the egg to the girl, and then it grows in the kind of in the tummy. They say if they ask a question that you don't think they're ready for, just say, well, that doesn't matter. Say, well, how does the seed get into the egg? Well, that doesn't matter for right now. What does matter is that it grows in the tummy until it's a baby that can breathe on its own and live on its own, with help, and then it comes out. How does it get out? Well, that doesn't matter either. Um, we'll talk about that later on. And that's fine. Kids are okay with that. They get a little older. Maybe they'll want to understand that the baby comes out of the vagina. This is important for girls once they start to realize that adult females menstruate. Why do you menstruate? It's like, well, when the baby comes out, it comes out through the vagina. And so there's kind of a whole process involved to prepare for that. When you don't have a baby, you're going to menstruate about once a month. And then they say, okay, and they can understand that. Now, once a kid starts going through puberty, well, now they actually need to know about sex. They need to know, how the seed gets to the egg, and that's not too hard to explain. And then you need to tell them about urges, because remember, this isn't just physical development, it's cognitive as well. These kids are going to have urges. They're going to want to kiss people, they're going to want to lick people, they're going to want to touch people, and they're not always going to want to know where they're going to touch people. They're just going to have these thoughts coming into their heads, and it can be rough. So they're going to talk to their friends. Their friends don't know anything, neither did your friends when you were a kid. So there's no reason not to just teach them. And these are just facts. They're not embarrassing. They're just how people work. It's no more embarrassing than how you walk. You weren't afraid to teach that to your kid because it's a natural part of his life, just like sex is going to be. Now, as far as urges go, they're going to have different urges for different people. And they're going to need to know how to handle these things. The fact that they're going to have to learn that they're going to want to do things that they're not going to do. Just like you want to have ice cream right now, but you're not going to. And that's fine. You got to get used to it. As a matter of fact, if you grow into it, being sexually aroused, being attracted to somebody is an incredibly enjoyable experience. We hold on to it. We like it. We enjoy watching people that we're never going to have sex with, but we want to. And it's just something that brings a smile to our face, and it can yours as well. Now, getting into the more social aspects of it, there's even a time when it's appropriate to start talking about pornography. And again, we like to put our morals and cultures and what the Pope told us into play. And the Pope is not a scientist. And there are some rather interesting statistics. For example, it has been shown that boys between the ages of 9 and 14 who have had exposure to pornography are 75% less likely to rape someone in their lives. And that is a huge number. It is so important because this gives them kind of an emotional sandbox in which they can explore and play. And the fact is, if they have access to a computer these days, they're going to find pornography. You don't have to point them to it. I've actually seen a 15-year-old, and the father called the person in and said, the kid's been getting, can you help with the computer? Because he's been getting viruses on the computer. So the guy's like, okay, well, 15-year-old boy, first, I will clear up the viruses on your computer. And second, I will show you where the free porn sites are, so that you do not have to continue to put viruses on your computer. Because the fact of the matter is they're going to seek it out. And it's not bad. It's actually considered healthy. There's several other studies that they've found that people who watch pornography are actually sexually more healthy, more ready for sex at certain ages, that sort of thing, than people who don't watch pornography. And But at the same time, you have to actually talk to them about it. You have to explain to them that these are not documentaries by any stretch of the imagination. This is not what girls like. And this isn't what guys like either. Guys don't like those awkward positions. Those are just for camera angles. You know, you were to we're having somewhat of a social problem these days because most teenage boys who, like I said, they don't have their parents tell them anything about sex. They're watching pornography and they're now thinking that every girl likes anal, and it's just not true. Meanwhile, the girls are feeling pressured, and it's getting to be kind of a sexual problem with teenagers. These are not documentaries. This is for shock and awe. This is as much of a documentary as watching the movie Triple X and thinking that's how life is lived. It's not. So you got to kind of do the emotional education with everything. Even things that you might not necessarily be comfortable with them. It's just a natural part of our lives. It leads to some teen pregnancy. Now, teen pregnancy is not adaptable to our culture in any way. Physiologically, we're adaptable to it. There's a chart in the book that mentions teen pregnancy and a lot of the developed countries. And we actually have a teen pregnancy rate of a third world country. We have a very high rate of teen pregnancy. And a lot of this is based on the illusion of independence. We have these typically girls, although boys as well, who really want to be independent. They really think they can be independent, but their parents will not allow them to be. So they're naturally going to act out, and they're going to do things that adults would do, and this is going to lead to things like pregnancy. When they're not prepared for it, even socially, because having a child is as much of a social thing as it is a personal thing. So we'll continue on this chapter next time. Pretty interesting subject.